Some time ago, on a planet called Ripple Star, the fairy-like inhabitants were enjoying a peaceful afternoon when suddenly a darkness overtook the skies. Fearing this darkness, the Fairy Queen tasks Ribbon with keeping a sacred crystal secure and sends her on an escape mission. Unfortunately, supervillain Dark Matter notices the escape and pursues, eventually catching up with Ribbon and shattering the crystal. As luck would have it, Ribbon just so happens to land on planet Popstar, crashing into the ultimate hero, Kirby. So struck by Ribbon's beauty, Kirby agrees to help her collect all of the Crystal Shards and send Dark Matter packing for the third and final time. And with that, Kirby 64 begins. Kirby 64 remains remarkably similar to the previous Dreamland titles. Despite being 3D, the developers opted to retain 2D gameplay, something novel during the peak of 3D platformers, but much more common in the modern day. As a result, Kirby 64 is still exceptionally playable. There are no 3D corridors to confuse the camera, there is no awkward 3D jumping, no clumsy combat, and figuring out where to go or what to do is simple and intuitive. In short, the things that made Kirby so successful up to this point remain, and Kirby transitioned to 3D seamlessly without any growing pains. Kirby still controls well with a predictable jump arc, flexible mid-air maneuverability, quick acceleration with a slow top speed, and features forgiving collision detection, though there does seem to be a touch of input lag. I am playing this on Kirby's Dream Collection for the Wii, so maybe this is the culprit, but the controls don't feel as immediate as the previous games. Anyway, despite not having Dreamland in the title, Kirby 64 feels like a continuation of the Dreamland saga. Kirby can still run by double tapping a direction on the D-pad. The copy ability lineup is also similar. Burn offers Kirby a dash attack, Needle turns Kirby into an indestructible ball, Cutter is a projectile attack, and Bomb allows an arced projectile. Most interesting are the changes to Stone, Ice, and Spark. When activated, Kirby can continue moving, although at a slow pace. If one was ever annoyed at how many of the previous power-ups stopped Kirby in his tracks, these are a nice evolution to the respective power-ups. The main gimmick in Kirby 64 is the ability to combine two copy abilities into a brand new one. Generally, the way to do this is to reject a currently equipped ability and then use it as a projectile to take down another ability-enabled enemy. If successful, the resulting star will contain an all-new ability harnessed from both. For those keeping track, this means 28 new abilities to mess around with. As expected, these 28 combination abilities are usually more powerful than a lone ability. These unique power-ups are also required to locate many of the 72 Crystal Shards the player needs to collect to unlock the final boss and receive the true ending. One thing I like about some of these is how they add new mechanics for the player to learn and master. For example, combining Cutter and Burning gives the player a flame sword. One can swing it as expected, but pressing up will make Kirby hold the sword above his head, and then pressing the action button allows it to be thrown like a projectile. Combining Rock and Bomb creates Dynamite. The blast radius is massive, but pressing down equips Kirby with a hard hat, so he doesn't take damage upon ignition. While not every combination adds alternate controls, I do appreciate the added complexity to a game which has been traditionally simple. Like Dreamland 3, the floating mechanic is relegated to the jump button, acting sort of like a double jump, with multiple presses being needed to keep traveling upward. Unlike Dreamland 3, Kirby cannot float infinitely anymore. Instead, the floating is time limited to around 10 seconds. This is a massive change, and a welcome one. One of my biggest gripes with the Kirby franchise is how the developers rarely put the infinite flying to good use, and would often design levels without consideration to Kirby's flight, allowing players to bypass large sections of past games entirely. With the infinite flight removed, I found myself relying on it less, and instead platforming and using the copy abilities. The idea behind Kirby from the beginning has always been to make a franchise that is accessible to all skill levels, with Kirby's flight eliminating falling into death pits being the main example. However, the infinite flight took this to an extreme, often removing players player skill entirely, which I don't like. In Kirby 64, it feels like the original goal has been realized in the most complete way. If one does happen to fall into a pit, they can press the jump button to quickly recover and avoid death. However, the overpowered nature of flight has been reined in, forcing players to overcome obstacles and enemies instead of avoid them. Structurally, Kirby 64 doesn't break much new ground. A player must make their way through 3 or 4 levels in a world, which will unlock an end boss encounter. Defeating an end boss will unlock the next world, with the process repeating until the game is done. Unfortunately, some things in Kirby 64 have gotten worse. In Kirby's Dream Land 2, mid-bosses were mostly easy, but they had multiple attacks which were randomized. This reduced repetition and forced players to pay attention. This was all but eliminated in Dream Land 3, with the mid-bosses repeating the same attacks over and over until defeated. In Kirby 64, the mid-bosses can be defeated before they even attack if a player is equipped with the proper ability. While I appreciate HAL Laboratories' desire to design a game which appeals to a wide audience rather than just a hardcore base, I believe there is a point where one goes too far, mistaking easy patterns for accessibility. Standing in one spot pressing the attack button isn't fun for anyone. Mid-bosses aside, another aspect I think Kirby 64 improves upon is gameplay variety. 2 new elements are introduced which change up the classic Kirby gameplay. First, there are King Dedede sections. King Dedede's main weapon is his trademark hammer. With it, the player must break through walls and navigate new challenges, either mazes or more timing-based hazards. While it may not work as a standalone game, the quality is high and they break up the standard gameplay nicely, without being awful. Second, there are minecart-styled sections. I have to assume these were inspired by Donkey Kong Country, but perhaps some other game did it first. In any case, there are a few moments where the player is forced into a craft and must avoid obstacles during an auto-scrolling section. There are 2 interesting things to note here. One, the camera is centered rather than off-center, giving the player a better view of what is ahead. Second, the Waddle Dee gives a visual cue of upcoming danger, negating the need for a better camera. While the King Dedede moments and the minecart segments aren't spectacular, they do follow the design principles of the Kirby franchise. They aren't overly difficult and the controls are dead simple. These 2 elements allow them to fit right into the adventure, acting as a pleasant change of pace now and again, rather than feeling like shoehorned elements for variety's sake. Speaking of variety, this is another area Kirby 64 excels. The 6 worlds do a sufficient job with different obstacles and hazards to keep the game interesting during the 22 stages. Planet Popstar is a relatively benign first world. The platforming is extremely basic, with little to test a player's dexterity. Instead, these stages seem designed to allow a player to familiarize themselves with the game's core mechanics, including combat, jumping, and climbing. Rockstar adds crushing hazards, a chase sequence with quicksand up a vertical area, swimming, cannons, and moving platforms. Aquastar adds conveyors in the form of rushing water, collapsing platforms, and water currents. Neostar adds collapsing ground and also starts to build upon previous concepts. Moving platforms are smaller and come in multiples. The climbing is made more difficult with moving vines. Crushing obstacles cannot be floated over. There is lava with touch damage, and entire crushing sections with safe spots to race to. Shiverstar increases the platforming challenge with smaller platforms over bottomless pits, more difficult conveyor sections, tighter crushing sections, and adds wind currents and those green booster things. World 6, Ripple Star, doesn't add anything. In fact, the first 5 worlds of Kirby 64 progress nicely. Each world includes new elements to keep things fresh, and also expands upon previous concepts with more challenging arrangements. It feels like maybe the developers attempted to make Ripple Star a gauntlet of enemies, building up to the final boss, but the enemy encounters are generally easy, and any sort of build up to a final boss is lost. At least there are just 3 stages instead of 4, I guess. Thankfully, the good progression is present in the end boss encounters too. Wispy Woods is the prototypical first Kirby boss. The player can either suck in fruit to use as projectiles or use a copy ability. It is easy for sure, but I should give the developers credit for keeping the battle moving. There isn't a lot of downtime waiting for Wispy to be vulnerable. Rather, he attacks frequent enough to keep the player engaged, preventing standing around and waiting. The circular arena presented with Wispy evolves with picks. This battle escalates with Kirby having to avoid the various attack patterns from 3 different, diamonds? The battle starts off slow with few projectiles for the player to use to inflict damage, but by the end, the playfield is littered with the tools needed for Kirby to come out victorious. Acro is an underwater boss and introduces something new to the Kirby end boss formula. After taking down the boss's initial life bar, the arena changes and a second round against the Orca Whale is presented. It auto-scrolls as well, and the player must take care not to fall below the scrolling screen. Glabman increases the challenge with a lava floor, meaning at times there are few safe places to avoid damage during some of the attack patterns. A tried and true formula which would be reused in 2.5D platformers in the future. It includes a second phase too. Moving along, there is HRH and HRE, another 2-phase boss fight, first as a stationary battle and then as a chasing one. This battle is easier than Acro or Glabman, but it does take a couple of tries to learn the patterns and strategies, which is nice. Lastly, there is Miracle Matter, which is, without a doubt, the greatest Kirby boss found in the Dark Matter trilogy. What makes this boss so terrific is it uses all 7 copy abilities. Even better, it expects the player to understand each of his 7 attacks, because he is only weak to that copy ability during that particular phase. This means every time Miracle Matter changes, the player must reject their current ability or combine it if beneficial in order to continue doing damage. With 7 different patterns to learn and the constant changing of tactics, Miracle Matter ends up being the perfect conclusion to the regular quest. Of course, there is a true final boss lurking once one gathers the 72 Crystal Shards. But first, let's talk about Kirby 64's presentation. When I first fired up the game, I found the graphics to be a bit lackluster. Planet Pop feels barren compared to the sprite-based titles, with just a few elements scattered about an open field. The forested areas in the second stage offer a similar conundrum, with the forest looking sparse with few trees poking out of the forest floor. Thankfully, the art direction picks up steam by the third stage, with a large structure in the background helping Popstar feel more populated and less empty. The rest of Kirby 64 remains inconsistent. Sometimes areas feel dense and visually interesting, and other times the background is a little too open, and the 2.5D platforming looks silly against a wide open expanse. Playing this on the Wii, the texture work looks alright. Textures are small and repeat frequently, but the limitation is used as part of the design, and repeated textures harken back to the previous generation of gaming. The various geometric patterns are pleasing enough to look at, with the contrasting or complementary colors chosen never looking ghastly and always easy on the eyes. The artists were also not afraid of flat shading either, with most enemies in the game using polygons for detail rather than textures, possibly freeing up space for those environments. Is this the best looking game of the 5th generation? No. Perhaps I've just gotten used to Crash or Spyro, which make Kirby 64 look primitive by comparison, but it isn't ugly either. The frame rate seems to stay around 30 frames per second rather than 20, helping the gameplay look smooth, and Kirby continues to feature an outstanding amount of animation, further helping this one age better than some of its lesser contemporaries. I don't think anyone would confuse this for a Wii or GameCube game, but the textures, colors, and excellent animation look good on a reasonably sized TV. I still wish the developers shied away from the open areas though. The music follows suit. As expected, the compositions presented in Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards are of the high-energy type, almost whimsical with the instrument selections, but distinctly Kirby. While none of the hooks found in the game reach the brilliance of the original soundtrack, nothing here is boring either. There is a wide variety of instruments, from various horns and bells to a more synthesized selection, offering new genres not featured in the series thus far. About my only complaint would be at times the music music almost seems too hectic, not matching the somewhat slow action found on the screen. At times, this clashing of fast music and slow action can be distracting, but that is about my only complaint. If I'm honest, I'm running out of things to say about Kirby music after 4 straight adventures. If one enjoyed the music in the previous games, they'll enjoy the all-new soundtrack. If one finds Kirby music lacks emotion, depth, or complexity, they'll likely find the same complaints here. So, with the presentation out of the way, let's get to the spoiler-heavy section of this video. As noted, there are 72 Crystal Shards to find and collect in Kirby 64. Each of the 6 end-boss fights reward 1 crystal, and each level has 3. These can be hidden in the stage, requiring the player to venture off the beaten path. A mid-boss may need to be defeated, sometimes a puzzle needs to be solved, and of course, oftentimes copy abilities will be needed to reveal their location. As best as I can tell, the solution to the various blocks are revealed in the 2 colors making up the checkerboard patterns. Brown and black requires rock and bomb, for example. I didn't realize this at first, but it is one of those things one should eventually notice or figure out. Once one learns this, the rest of the block breaking becomes logical enough. The puzzles are worth an extra look too, not so much in what they are, but what they aren't. Gone are the memory puzzles, and in their place something far less ridiculous. The player will first encounter Adeline, who paints a clue, and then use the clue to break blocks or press buttons in a specific order. One even requires a specific combination ability to light up the dark room containing the clue, which is clever. In all honesty, it is hard to complain about collecting the shards. The stages are fairly linear, meaning it is simple enough to check every nook and cranny. Out-of-place multicolored blocks require combination abilities of the same color to break, and single-colored blocks require just 1 copy ability to break. It's intuitive enough. Well, mostly. The level select also does a nice job letting the player know if all 3 shards were found, and if not, which is missing, the first, second, or third. As locating all of these are required to unlock the final boss and receive the true ending, I appreciate how these feel more thoughtful and less cryptic or obnoxious compared to the previous titles. Speaking of final boss, the one in Kirby 64 is yet another flying boss. If the design looks familiar, that's because it feels like Sonic 06 ripped off the design a few years later. Odd, and like Sonic 06, this boss is underwhelming. It isn't even intuitive if I'm honest. The player is supposed to keep attacking the eye, which will eventually cause it to lean forward, revealing a halo. The player is then supposed to shoot at the halo, which will eventually cause the enemy to tilt the other way, revealing a tail. Hitting the tail is the only way to damage the boss. The boss can be quickly defeated in just 2 cycles. Compared to the amazing Miracle Matter, this is disappointing. Anyway, with this creature defeated, Dark Matter is presumed destroyed, thus bringing an end to the Dark Matter trilogy. The end cinematic also shows Ribbon giving Kirby a kiss, thus giving the pink puffball a love interest for fans to speculate about for years to come. And then, of course, the credits roll. If you've made it this far into the Kirby Marathon, you may have noticed I've been more positive about Kirby 64 compared to its predecessors. And this is because I feel like the developers stepped back and really thought about what made a Kirby game work, and what things were not adding to the formula, or even holding it back. The most obvious being Kirby's floating. In retrospect, this might not seem like a big deal, but I think praise is deserved for dramatically changing one of the trademark features. Reducing the float time to around 10 seconds alters the game in a profound way, and the developers deserve credit for such boldness. This is a terrific change, as most of the float above the levels aspect of earlier titles is removed. That isn't to say Kirby 64 is perfect. Some abilities remain overpowered. The rock ability has gone from a gimmick to being almost game-breaking. The rock is immune to virtually everything, which breaks moments like this where the level is designed for the player to take cover from incoming cannon fire, but the cannon cannot damage Kirby in this state, making the section a little silly. Backtracking also returns, with the game requiring the player to visit a previous level to grab abilities and then carry them through to the current level. As best as I can tell, this is required 4 times, with all 4 occurrences happening in the back half of the game. It isn't the worst thing in the world, thanks to the color-coded blocks eliminated trial and error guesswork, but something about revisiting past stages, exiting, and finally returning to the current stage feels like padding. There isn't any reason the abilities required aren't in the level itself. Take stage 4-2 for example. The player needs the rock and bomb abilities, neither of which is found in the stage. The rock and bomb must also be retained for most of the level, as the breakable wall needing this combo is near the end, with nearly an entire level to traverse through, combined with the fact that dynamite kinda sucks as a weapon, meaning taking 6 hits of damage is a real possibility, and a player could be revisiting older stages over and over, wasting a lot of time. On the flip side, as the dynamite does kinda suck as an offensive weapon and the float power is limited, the player's best option for dealing with enemies is the slide kick. While virtually useless previously, the slide kick serves a purpose in Kirby 64, which I appreciate. There are some good design decisions besides the slide kick too. In stage 4-1, there are sections of the ground which collapse. The player is shown this, with the level design guiding the player to the hazard with a star. Later on, this technique is required to locate a Crystal Shard, but because the game taught the player this, it isn't too cryptic. Same goes for stage 2-2. It isn't obvious the floors on the structure collapse. However, the player is forced through a long corridor and the floor collapses behind Kirby, which again is needed to reach another Crystal Shard. Stage 3-3 features a large mountain, which seems inconspicuous at first. Thankfully, a water spout pushes the player upward, alerting one to the fact they should head upwards and investigate, again leading to a Crystal Shard. These are polished moments and show the designers were thinking about the player experience and how one might traverse a level, interact with enemies, and what one does and doesn't see when navigating levels. This level of care is something I don't often feel when playing Kirby games, where instead it felt like dozens of ideas were crammed into a game without regard to how they might impact the experience. That isn't to say the design is flawless. At times the camera pans up and down, obscuring the platform Kirby is supposed to land on. The game completely fails to teach the player Rick the hamster can climb walls, which is necessary for a Crystal Shard and ultimately needed to beat the game. And of course, the mid-boss battles are a joke. But overall, Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards is surprisingly good, and dare I say, underrated, or at least underappreciated. This isn't just Kirby with polygons, but rather, the developers improved the formula and crafted an adventure often superior to its predecessors. The 2D plane probably works in its favor as well, preventing the developers from falling down the collectathon rabbit hole. The level design is mostly great, with each new world adding new hazards and obstacles. The difficulty progression is mostly excellent, increasing the challenge as the adventure wears on. There is a decent amount of variety with alternate playstyles, without sacrificing quality, and the end boss fights are the best found in the Dark Matter trilogy. The collecting aspect is perhaps the best the series has seen thus far. The color-coordinated blocks remove the mystery and shift the challenge from guessing to retaining the 1 or 2 copy abilities until the block is reached. And because the life bar doesn't reset between levels, this can be occasionally challenging. All of these make Kirby 64 an engaging platformer that is enjoyable to play from beginning to end. By the time the player reaches the end of the game, they'll be left wanting more, instead of feeling like the game has overstayed its welcome. While Kirby 64 may not make any N64 best of lists and is rarely a favorite for fans of the series, I truly believe it is worth a look and is a must play for fans of the genre.